just continued shooting. I figured, I shot Mrs. Nesbitt and just started shooting everybody else.
Anyone that's human would have remorse for what happened. I'm very ashamed of my participation in that crime. I feel a lot of remorse for the victims and the family of the victims.
Imagine this. 4 hostages, forced to drink a deadly chemical, their skin burning and blistering as the criminals laugh. The horror of the hi-fi shop murders unfolds as Dale Pierre and William Andrews' night of terror becomes the stuff of legend in Utah. But this wasn't just a robbery gone wrong. It was a crime so brutal that it would change lives forever. On April 22, 1974, in Ogden, Utah, 2 airmen turned a mundane robbery into a nightmare. Pierre and Andrews entered the hi-fi shop with only one goal: to rob. But what happened next would become one of the most shocking criminal cases in Utah's history. Imagine the horror, the devastation, and the lasting scars that this tragedy left behind. These were real people, real lives shattered, and the impact ripples through generations. If you feel moved by this story, if you believe these victims and survivors deserve to be remembered, don't just watch. Take a moment to make your voice heard. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story has traveled. If you found this video important, hit that subscribe button. We work hard to bring these stories to light, and by subscribing, you help us keep these important conversations going. And if you're one of the few who can't bring yourself to subscribe, please let us know why in the comments. Your feedback matters, and we're here to listen. In this gripping tale, we'll take you through every chilling detail of the hi-fi shop murders, starting with the brutal crime that shocked a peaceful town and rocked the nation. From there, we'll follow the intense investigation, one that stretched across military bases and involved a relentless search for justice. As the story unfolds, we'll delve into the trial that captivated Utah, as the entire state watched closely to see if Pierre and Andrews would face the death penalty for their unspeakable actions. But this isn't just a story about the crime. It's also a story about the people affected. You'll hear from the survivors, the victims' families, and the lasting emotional scars that shaped their lives long after the crime. What did they endure? What toll did it take on them, physically, mentally, emotionally? The community of Ogden will never be the same. For years, the memories of that night haunted them, and the ripples of this tragedy stretched far beyond Utah. As we peel back the layers, we'll also explore the moral complexities of the death penalty. Was it justified? Did the executions of Pierre and Andrews bring closure to the victims' families, or was it simply a reflection of the anger and sorrow the crime left behind? By the end of this journey, we'll not only have uncovered the facts and the cold truths of what happened that night, we'll have looked deeper into the human side of the story. We'll see how these events played out on the ground, how it felt to live in Ogden during that time, and how the execution of 2 men couldn't quite erase the scars left behind. On April 22, 1974, 2 young airmen, 21-year-old Dale Pierre and 19-year-old William Andrews, strolled into a quiet electronics store in Ogden, Utah, expecting a quick and easy heist. But what they did next would transform this humble store into a scene so horrific that it would haunt the community for decades. The hi-fi shop, a place where customers once casually browsed for stereo equipment, was about to become the epicenter of terror. As the doors of the shop closed behind them, Pierre and Andrews turned a routine robbery into a blood-soaked nightmare that no one could have imagined. The victims, innocent employees and customers, were about to face a brutal fate they never saw coming. What started as a simple crime quickly spiraled into one of the most gruesome and shocking acts of violence in American history. A place where people once came to buy stereos would now be marked as the site of unimaginable horror, forever stained by the memories of what happened within those walls. The hi-fi shop murders didn't just send shockwaves through Utah. This case captured the attention of the entire nation. What began as a seemingly straightforward robbery quickly spiraled into an unimaginable act of violence that left communities in disbelief. The cold-blooded nature of the crime, coupled with the fact that it was carried out by two young men in the military, ignited fierce debates about the state of America's justice system and the disturbing potential for violence, even within its most disciplined institutions. As details emerged, the media frenzy intensified. Headlines across the country were filled with graphic descriptions and questions about how and why Pierre and Andrews, two airmen with access to military training, could commit such horrifying acts. Was it the pressure of their military lives, the influence of toxic masculinity, or were they simply sociopaths in uniform? The brutality of the murders stunned even seasoned crime reporters. The press coverage fueled public fear and disbelief while also raising uncomfortable questions about the limits of violence and the mental state of those tasked with serving the country. The case became a symbol of a dark undercurrent in American society, where no one, no matter their background or training, was immune to committing heinous acts. As the story unfolded, people everywhere were forced to confront a chilling reality. Could this happen in any small town? Could these types of atrocities be lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life?
Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews weren't just two young airmen. They were individuals whose actions would forever stain the walls of the hi-fi shop. What started as a robbery quickly escalated into a terrifying act of violence that left 5 people brutalized. But what pushed these young men, both trained in military discipline, to commit such unspeakable acts? Was it a desperate need for money, or was there something much darker at play within their minds? Pierre, the more dominant of the two, showed a chilling lack of empathy. His actions were calculated, methodical, and horrifyingly cold. His decision to escalate the crime from theft to torture was not an impulsive act. He seemed almost detached from the suffering of his victims. As he poured Drano into their mouths and shot them in cold blood, Pierre demonstrated a disturbing disregard for human life, perhaps indicative of a deeper psychological void. His refusal to show any remorse, even when convicted and on death row, suggests that he may have viewed the lives of his victims as disposable, pawns in a game driven by his desire for power and control. On the other hand, Andrews' involvement in the crime raises significant questions about moral agency. Though he claimed to have not pulled the trigger, his complicity was undeniable. Andrews was fully aware of Pierre's plans and eagerly participated in every aspect of the crime. The question that lingers, was he a follower, a man caught in Pierre's influence, or was there a shared darkness in both of them that led to this horrific spree? His actions didn't just stem from a desire for money, but seemed rooted in a willingness to inflict suffering, perhaps driven by anger or a need for validation.
The two men had backgrounds that seemed unremarkable on the surface, both enlisted in the military, presumably following the path of discipline in service. But what lies beneath the surface of their actions? Were there early warning signs, childhood trauma, a history of violent behavior, or even unchecked anger? Were they simply two products of an environment that failed to intervene in their growing sense of entitlement and disregard for others? Understanding their psychological makeup may not provide easy answers, but it's essential to unpack what led them to cross the line between right and wrong in such a devastating way. Stanley Walker was 20 years old when he walked into the hi-fi shop on that fateful day. He was young, full of dreams, and looking forward to the next chapter in his life. Stanley had just completed his last shift at the shop before moving away to pursue greater opportunities. He was the kind of young man who smiled easily and had a warmth about him, someone who brought a sense of comfort to those around him. His life was still unfolding, with so much ahead of him, until it was abruptly and violently stolen from him. Michelle Ansley, just 18, was a promising young woman whose future was filled with potential. She had recently graduated from high school and was working at the hi-fi shop while planning her next steps. Michelle had a contagious energy about her, a vivacious spirit that lit up every room she entered. She was just beginning her adult life with aspirations, dreams, and the innocent optimism that often defines youth. The tragedy that befell her not only cut her life short, but also shattered the hopes of those who loved her, leaving them to wonder what kind of life she might have had.
Then there was Carol Nabet, a 52-year-old mother who was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Carol had come to the hi-fi shop to pick up her son, Courtney Nabet, who had parked his car outside while he worked inside. She never imagined that this routine errand would lead to such horror. Carol, a kind and caring mother, had dedicated her life to her children, always putting them first. Her life, filled with love and nurturing, was tragically cut short by the violence of that night. Her death left a void that her family would never be able to fill. Courtney Nabet, her son, was 18 at the time, a young man trying to find his place in the world. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, simply trying to thank Stanley for letting him park his car outside. Courtney's survival after being shot in the head was a miracle, but it came at a staggering cost. His permanent brain damage would alter his life forever. The trauma he endured that night was something no young person should have to face, and it left him and his family with scars that would never fade. Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, was the last victim to enter the hi-fi shop. Worried about his son after hearing nothing from him, Orrin entered the store only to find himself in the middle of a nightmare. He was brutally attacked, strangled to the point of near death, and left for dead in the basement. Miraculously, Orrin survived the brutal assault, but the emotional scars from that night, knowing his son had died in such horrific circumstances, would haunt him for the rest of his life. These weren't just victims. They were individuals with their own stories, their own futures, and their own families. Stanley had dreams of moving on to new horizons. Michelle was about to start her adult life. Carol was a loving mother who simply wanted to pick up her son. Courtney was a young man beginning to navigate adulthood, and Orrin was a father trying to protect his son. Their lives, filled with promise, were shattered in an instant by two men who showed no mercy.
The families left behind were left not only with grief, but with the burden of unanswered questions. How do you come to terms with such a violent loss? How do you make peace with the fact that your loved one was taken away in such a brutal and senseless manner? The survivors, especially Orrin and Courtney, would carry the emotional and physical weight of that night for the rest of their lives, never fully able to escape the memories of what happened at the hi-fi shop. Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, was one of the few who survived the massacre, but survival came at an unbearable cost. Orrin entered the hi-fi shop that night, searching for his son, only to become a victim in the same nightmare. He was brutally strangled to the point of unconsciousness, left for dead among the bodies of his son and the others. When Orrin regained consciousness, he discovered the unimaginable horror that had unfolded. His son, Stanley, was gone, murdered in cold blood. Living through that experience left a scar on Orrin that would never heal. He was forced to bear the weight of witnessing his child's violent death, an event so traumatic that it would haunt him for the rest of his life. He had to process the horror of being unable to protect his son and the sheer helplessness that came with it. Orrin spent the rest of his days struggling with the emotional aftermath of losing Stanley in such a horrific way. The grief he endured was compounded by guilt, trauma, and the profound loss of a son he could never replace.
Then there was Courtney Naibet, who somehow survived the unthinkable. At just 18 years old, he was shot in the head and left for dead. Miraculously, he survived, but the cost was immense. Courtney suffered permanent brain damage that forever altered his life. Once a vibrant young man with a future ahead of him, Courtney's survival became a lifelong reminder of the violence he had endured. His family watched as he struggled with the consequences of his injuries, the emotional and physical toll a constant reminder of the night that changed everything. For Courtney's family, the trauma was equally profound. His mother, Carol Naibet, had gone to the hi-fi shop to pick up her son, but instead she lost her life in a senseless act of violence. Her death left a devastating hole in the lives of her family, particularly Courtney. The trauma of seeing her son gravely wounded, yet somehow still alive, weighed heavily on Carol's family, who had already lost her in such an agonizing way. For Courtney's father and the rest of his family, it was a painful journey of watching their son struggle, feeling torn between relief that he survived and grief for the life he had lost. Their family was forever changed, not just by the loss of Carol, but by the deep emotional scars left on Courtney, whose life was altered irrevocably. The emotional toll on Stanley's mother, Michelle Ansley's family, and the other victims was no less devastating. Their families were left grappling with the emptiness of losing someone so suddenly and violently. Michelle's parents, in particular, were forced to reckon with the fact that their daughter was taken so early, with no warning, and under such horrific circumstances. For the parents of all the victims, the pain of that night lingered long after the criminals were arrested and executed.
Pierre, already agitated, began barking orders, demanding they lie down. He wasn't there for money alone. His violent intent was clear. The mood shifted from confusion to fear, and the situation grew more ominous by the second. Pierre reached for the bottle of Drano he had brought along, convinced it would quickly end the victims' lives. He forced Stanley and Michelle to drink the toxic liquid, believing it would kill them fast. The chemical burned their mouths and throats, but it didn't work as he hoped. The pain was unbearable, and the victims screamed in agony. Realizing the liquid wasn't killing them fast enough, Pierre's frustration grew. The terror intensified as he reached for his gun. In one brutal moment, he shot Stanley Walker in the back of the head, instantly killing him. Michelle screamed in horror as she tried to flee, but Pierre quickly turned the gun on her. She was shot point blank, her life extinguished in seconds. Now Pierre and Andrews had 5 hostages, each one terrified for their life. The horror escalated as Pierre took it even further, shooting Courtney in the head, though he miraculously survived. Carol was also shot, succumbing to her wounds later at the hospital.
But Pierre wasn't done. He had planned to leave no witnesses. As he moved toward the final hostage, Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, arrived at the shop, worried about his son. But he was immediately overpowered. Pierre strangled Orrin with a cord, believing he had killed him, and left him to die with the others. Orrin survived the brutal attack, however, and his testimony would become crucial in the investigation. Pierre turned the gun on Michelle, and without hesitation, he pulled the trigger, ending her life in a split second. Courtney Naibet, 18, walked in, unaware of the horror inside. He was dragged into the basement, adding to the list of victims. Moments later, Carol Naibet, 52, Courtney's mother, entered the shop, only to meet the same fate. Pierre shot her without a second thought. By the time Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, arrived, Pierre was beyond control. He attempted to strangle Orrin, leaving him unconscious, but Orrin survived. Pierre and Andrews fled, taking stolen equipment, believing they'd gotten away. But what they didn't count on was the investigation that would soon uncover the truth, sealing their fate.
Before we dive deeper into the story, I just want to take a moment to thank you for watching. If you're finding this story compelling, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps us out and lets us know you want more content like this. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. We've got more true crime stories and gripping content coming your way. Also, if you're watching from somewhere unique, drop a comment below and let us know where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our viewers around the world.
But the nightmare didn't end there. The brutality continued to escalate, with every moment dripping with desperation and rage. Pierre had already crossed a line. What began as a robbery turned into something much darker. His frustration mounted, and the violence grew colder with each passing second. Then, just as Orrin Walker, Stanley's father, arrived at the shop, the tension reached its breaking point. Orrin, unaware of the horror that had already unfolded, came looking for his son, desperate to find out why Stanley hadn't returned his calls. He stepped into the hi-fi shop, and that moment would seal his fate. Pierre, seeing another potential threat, wasted no time. With one swift motion, he grabbed Orrin and began to strangle him, the pressure building as Orrin struggled for air. The world around Orrin began to blur as his vision darkened. Pierre thought he had silenced him, that he had snuffed out the last remaining witness. But in a twist of fate, Orrin didn't die. He somehow found the strength to fight back, gasping for air as the seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Pierre left him for dead, thinking the job was done.
The investigation into the hi-fi shop murders began with little more than confusion and a few scattered clues. At first, the police had no clear leads, and it seemed like the case could go cold. But as the weeks passed, a breakthrough came in the form of tips from military personnel at Hill Air Force Base, where both Pierre and Andrews were stationed. Word spread among the airmen, and some began to piece together the connection between the two men and the brutal crime. The investigators acted quickly. They zeroed in on the pair, and a search of their barracks revealed critical evidence. Inside, they found stolen stereo equipment, items that had been taken from the hi-fi shop, as well as personal belongings belonging to the victims, things that had no business being in their possession. It was clear now. Pierre and Andrews were the perpetrators. But the hunt for justice didn't stop there. The evidence mounted, and soon the authorities found themselves chasing down a complex web of lies, alibis, and increasingly damning physical evidence. Interviews with witnesses, analysis of ballistics reports, and the testimony of the survivors all painted a damning picture of what had really happened that night. The investigation was relentless, and each turning point in the case seemed to uncover even more shocking truths.
The discovery of the stolen items from Pierre and Andrews, combined with Orrin Walker's testimony about the events he witnessed, provided the final pieces of the puzzle. The two men were arrested and charged, and the trail of evidence led directly to their conviction. What started as a cold case was now a clear path to justice, and the truth about the hi-fi shop murders was about to be laid bare. The trial of Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews was nothing short of intense, filled with moments of raw emotion, legal strategy, and public scrutiny. Inside the courtroom, Pierre remained defiant, showing no remorse for the brutal murders he had committed. His cold demeanor sent a chilling message, making it clear that he saw his actions as justified.
When asked about the murders, he simply stared at the jury, offering no apology, no signs of regret, just a stone-cold indifference to the lives he had destroyed. Andrews, however, took a different approach. Throughout the trial, he maintained that he was not the one who pulled the trigger. He claimed that while he had been complicit in the crime, he wasn't responsible for the deaths. Andrews argued that he was influenced by Pierre, a willing participant but not the mastermind. His defense painted him as a follower, a man who had gone along with Pierre's plans out of fear or peer pressure, though the evidence against him was damning.
The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution presented chilling evidence, photographs of the crime scene, autopsy reports, and the testimonies of the surviving victims, Orrin Walker and Courtney Naibit. Their emotional accounts painted a vivid picture of the horror that unfolded that night, each detail more devastating than the last. Orrin, in particular, was a key witness, his testimony about being strangled by Pierre and witnessing the murders of his son and others providing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The jury, visibly shaken by the graphic nature of the case, struggled to comprehend how two young men, both seemingly ordinary, could commit such heinous acts. The fact that Pierre and Andrews were both military personnel added a layer of complexity to the trial. The prosecution used their military training against them, suggesting that their actions were premeditated and their ability to carry out such cold-blooded violence was a result of the very discipline they were supposed to uphold. As the trial reached its conclusion, the jury deliberated on their verdicts. The weight of the evidence was undeniable, and the brutal nature of the crime left little room for doubt. Pierre was convicted of first-degree murder, and the trial for Andrews mirrored his co-defendants, filled with shocking revelations, emotional testimonies, and a public outcry for justice. In the end, both men were sentenced to death, with Pierre receiving a lethal injection and Andrews facing execution by firing squad.
The trial concluded with the jury's guilty verdicts. Dale Selby Pierre and William Andrews were both sentenced to death. The weight of their crimes had been laid bare for all to see, and there was little debate about the severity of their actions. For the families of the victims, the sentences were a bitter but necessary form of justice. Pierre's execution was scheduled for 1987, and Andrews, whose case had been slightly more complicated, would face execution by firing squad in 1992. As the sentences were read aloud in court, the victims' families sat in silence, grappling with a mixture of emotions. For some, the sentence was a sense of finality, a long-awaited justice for the lives lost that night. But for others, the death penalty couldn't undo the destruction Pierre and Andrews had caused. Could the executions truly bring closure to a grief so deep? Or was the justice system simply carrying out a procedure, one that couldn't mend the irreparable damage done to the families and survivors? Pierre sat unmoving as the sentence was handed down, showing no remorse. Andrews, too, though quieter, displayed little emotion. The coldness in their demeanor contrasted sharply with the pain evident in the eyes of the survivors and the families who had waited so long for this moment. As the date for Pierre's execution drew nearer, the debate over the death penalty became louder. Was it right to take another life, even in the name of justice? The firing squad execution set for Andrews sparked its own set of ethical questions. How should such a violent act be carried out? And was it a fitting end for the man who had taken so many lives?
On August 28, 1987, Dale Selby Pierre was executed by lethal injection. A decade after the brutal murders, the state of Utah carried out its sentence, bringing an end to his life, but not to the trauma he caused. William Andrews followed 5 years later, on July 30, 1992, facing the firing squad. The chilling sight of a man strapped to a chair, surrounded by armed executioners, was a stark reminder of the violence he had brought into the world. But even as the finality of the execution settled in, the debate over whether the death penalty was the right choice only intensified.
Pierre and Andrews had shown little remorse for their actions during their trials, with Pierre particularly defiant in his indifference. Their brutal crimes raised the question, was the death penalty truly justice, or had it simply become a form of societal vengeance? Some argued that ending their lives couldn't undo the damage they had inflicted, while others believed it was the only fitting end for such cold-blooded killers. In Utah, the case became a focal point in the ongoing debate about capital punishment. Pierre's execution by lethal injection was a relatively routine affair, but Andrews' execution by firing squad sparked deep controversy. The firing squad was a method seldom used in the United States, and its inclusion in Utah's legal procedures led to moral and ethical questions that the state had to grapple with. Was this brutal method of execution in line with the idea of justice, or did it simply border on cruel and unusual punishment?
The executions didn't bring unanimous closure. For many in Ogden and across Utah, the deaths of Pierre and Andrews could never erase the terror, the grief, and the years of heartache. Survivors like Courtney Nabit and Orrin Walker were forced to live with the emotional scars long after the state had carried out its punishment. The hi-fi shop murders had become a dark chapter in Utah's history, and the legal aftermath, with its questions about justice and morality, left a lasting mark on the state's citizens. Utah's continued use of the firing squad in later executions further fueled the controversy, with some calling for reform and others defending it as a necessary and historically significant method of carrying out the ultimate penalty. The case, and the executions that followed, remain a powerful symbol of the complexities of justice, morality, and society's ability to cope with the unspeakable horrors committed by individuals like Pierre and Andrews. In the wake of the hi-fi shop murders, we are left asking ourselves hard questions. Was this a crime born of rage, or were there deeper issues at play, like a broken system that allowed two young men to carry out such violence? We examine the societal failures, the impact on victims' families, and what happens when a community is forced to grapple with its darkest secrets. Could this tragedy have been prevented? What role does society play in stopping such horrific acts before they happen? And when justice is served, does it truly heal the wounds, or does it leave a scar that's too deep to ever erase?
Thank you for watching and staying with us through this powerful and emotional story. We know these subjects aren't easy to discuss, but it's important to bring attention to the truth, the victims, and the consequences that ripple through society. If you found this video impactful, please like it and share your thoughts in the comments. We want to hear what you think. If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more deep dives into true crime stories. Your support helps us continue to share these vital narratives. And if you haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to know why. Your feedback helps us improve and better serve you, so feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks again for being here, and we'll see you in the next video.